All right, well, good afternoon. It is Wednesday at noon, so welcome to the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar Series. We're thrilled today to have Dr. Joshua Peschel, Associate Professor and Associate Chair for Research and Extension here at Iowa State University. Within the same department, we are in the Agricultural and Biosystems Engineering Department, and he's going to be talking about practical robotics and conservation. So with that, I will turn the virtual floor over to Joshua. And if you have questions, feel free to submit them in the chat and we'll do our Q&A following his talk.
All right. Hey, everybody. It's good to be with you today and talk about the work that I do in robotics here in agricultural and biosystems engineering here at Iowa State. And we'll just go ahead and get started into a little bit about what I primarily work on, which is called human robot interaction. And that's understanding as well as we can how people and robots can work together. And I work on a lot of technologies like user interfaces and sensors and robots. And so, kind of, if you want to pin down most of what I do, it kind of lies right at the intersection between people and robots. Now, when I talk about robots, I mean uncrewed aerial vehicles, little small flying robots, the little ground rovers like we send to Mars that we also send down to cornfields, and then small robot boats. So it's a kind of a multi-robot system approach, and I'll talk a little bit about each of those deployments in the context of conservation and environmental monitoring in, across four themes today. The reason why I work in this area is to really enable and empower people in the measurement and monitoring space. So if we think about data collection for conservation and different types of environmental systems or infrastructure in general, I would say, there are three main dimensions that we look at when we think about getting those measurements to manage. And that is really looking at spatial resolution of the data, temporal resolution of the data, so how well we can see it, what kind of glasses can we put on our sensors to best get a level of resolution that's good, how frequent can we get those data, and then how much does it cost per data point? And so if we think about some of the traditional remote sensing ways to gather that information, we might have something like Landsat that if we put it on our little axes there in those three dimensions I talked about, maybe we're at about a 30 meter resolution. And so it's pretty high up on that spatial scale. Maybe we get it like once a month, maybe every couple of weeks. So it's pushed out a little bit more on the temporal side. Cost is, middle of the road, depending on how you do those licensing aspects of it. If we compare and contrast that with, let's say, human collected data, maybe we can get a really good level of resolution, but not so often. And maybe the cost is pretty high. So for me, in thinking about how to measure and manage infrastructure, robots are more towards that ideal point where we can get pretty fine level spatial detail, maybe on the millimeter, sub-meter scale, as often as we possibly can, maybe sub daily, maybe sub hourly. And over time, after we've made the initial investment in the hardware and software in itself, kind of gets cheaper and cheaper over time. So that's really why I work on robotics technologies. And I work with trying to make those technologies different and better for people. Now, I'm not going to talk into detail about the HRI today. I'm going to talk more about the applications that we've had over the years in different environmental systems. I'll talk firstly about a project in India where we use small flying robots and small boats. And then I'll talk about a project in rainforests of Costa Rica where we used drones and combined that with some innovative drilling and sensor stuff we do here in cornfields and sorghum fields with the ground robots. And then I'll go ahead and wrap it up with our small robot boat work for waterways. So that's kind of where we're going and what I'll be talking about. So hopping in firstly to the problem and the project that I worked on in India, in general, if you work in this space, you know that there's not a whole lot of data. And we characterize that as a kind of a big sparse data problem, especially in places like India, where some areas are densely outfitted, but most places aren't. And that's a problem really everybody has. Now, for the problem that we were trying to address, this was near the city of Bangalore in what's called the Arkavathi River Basin. And Bangalore, as you see there on the map, is really at the intersection of two main catchments, and their drinking water reservoir there for the entire city of Bangalore, which is quite large, was drying over time. So we have a lack of a water source there for a large metropolitan area. And one of the things that we were doing is trying to understand why. So there was kind of five big hypothesized aspects of why that water source was drying. It could have been precipitation or climatic changes due to climate change, or it could have been more things with the watershed, maybe fragmentation of the landscape. There's a lot of spatial heterogeneity in that area. It could deal with groundwater extractions or just in general land cover, land use change. Now, when we looked at the data that was available for those river stations and those tanks that I'll talk about in a moment, we didn't really see any variations in precipitation or temperature. So climate change as an impactor in that general area on the drinking water was pretty much something we could rule out. So then it came down to how are people using the landscape? Now, there's two big challenges that I talked about. One, you have a lot of spatial heterogeneity that maybe you wouldn't see with remotely sensed satellite images, and that's where robots flying at a lower altitude could resolution data. And if there's a lot of turnover maybe in the volumes of water, we have to get those data at a higher temporal frequency. But given that we need high spatial resolution and high temporal resolution, we're dealing also with an economy of scale, so we can't, have an unlimited budget to deal with that. So we're getting these variations of space and time that give us these two challenges now that we've ruled out issues with climate. Now, these areas that I'm talking about are, like you see in the image here, there are these large sequences of agricultural tanks where water that flow into the reservoirs can be stored upstream and then also used by people along the river basin. And and so targeting these areas to try to measure with our robots were really what we wanted to focus on in the project. Now, it turns out that there's about 1,700 of these large agricultural tanks in the Arcavity Basin. And several of them are large enough that we could take in our robots and figure out how much water should really be stored there in the first place, because that's kind of the big thing they didn't know. They just knew that there wasn't water there. Um, they didn't really know how much should be given that there was some kind of precipitation event that was happening. And that's going to tie back really to that spatial heterogeneity in the landscape and how people are using it. Now, okay, we want to find out where we can get this, or how much is in there, how much water is in there. So the way that they do the bathymetric surveys in a lot of these conservation districts and conservation areas, they like send a person out in a boat with a yardstick. And that's pretty labor intensive. Many hours it can take to try to get measurements of these agricultural tanks that feed into these reservoirs. So that's where our robots come in. And we took our uncrewed aerial vehicle there that gives surface images that we can then use in our software to create, as we'll see in a couple of slides, a three-dimensional topographic surface of the basin. But then we can send in our small robot boats because the drone. So we need to be able to get above and below and fuse that together. So here's an example of us flying a drone in one of those basins. Here's an example of our small robot boat with our little mini sonar on it that can do soundings to the bottom of the tank. And that information gets recorded on board the boat. And when we combine it together, we take our UAV surface generated topography data with our robot boat bathymetry data and can fuse them together in a geographic information system to develop a three-dimensional representation of the area. And kind of the tie-up of what we were able to empower the people in that conservation district and water management district with is a stage storage curve of when a rainfall event that they themselves could measure would come in, how much water should be stored and available in those agricultural tanks. And we were able to do this for the whole sequence of basins there so they could better manage their water. Now, I will tell you one of the things that the robots, before I move on to the next topic, one of the things that the robots did reveal is because we were getting higher spatial resolution information. And we were able to see that the reasons why those tanks were not filling is because there was a transition in the land cover land use change from traditional food crops to cash crops because eucalyptus will yield more money than, let's say, cabbage. And so what people were doing, farmers were doing all along that basin, were building little check dams and little micro diversions that were draining those very, very slowly, those tanks out of the way. So the robots were not only able to tell us how much water should be there, which they didn't know, they were able to tell us likely where the water was being diverted to. So that was kind of a twofer that we were able to help with those conservation efforts, and people can make different and better decisions for their water management in that area that they had no idea about before. So that's the first place that robots can kind of help there in a sparse data region. So the second part of this that I want to talk about with you is using our small drones in Costa Rica to do rainforest monitoring. So in Costa Rica, we are interested in better closing the water balance in a highly dynamic region. You know, how much evapotranspiration was coming out of these rainforests, how much interception was happening, all this kind of stuff. But then how much soil moisture is in a lot of these places. And so that's where we have a little bit of an innovation with the drone, where we're able to, this is with collaborators at the University of Nebraska, have a drill that we fitted one of the drones with that I'll show you a little illustration here in a minute that can both auger down into the soil, can place sensors, but then it can also extract soil samples. Now, the general idea is that the small robot drone can fly from some starting point, navigate out to maybe the side of a hill somewhere, which would be hard to reach if you were just hiking. You're going to land, dig, implant the sensor, take the sample, and then return to home. And what that basically looks like is this. So you don't need to be near the robot. This can all be done remotely as long as you're piloting the robot as you would normally do. It doesn't have to be in an open field either. We've used it in Costa Rica on the sides of hill slopes and different things like that. But as you can see, the robot has been fitted with this payload that allows you to drill down. You'll be able to, let's say, implant a sensor or capture a sample and retrieve it. And then you're on your way to the next thing. So that's a little bit of an innovation with the drone that we've used in Costa Rica, again, developed primarily with our colleagues on that project in Nebraska. So in Costa Rica, as I mentioned, so we're on these large hill slopes where we're capturing measurements about water vapor, carbon dioxide, different levels of temperature, things like that. We've got all kinds of different payloads that we've deployed. And some of the data that have come off have been interesting. We had three main sites. We've been in primarily a rainforest site where we're able to look at elevations in CO2. I'll show you kind of how we're flying that CO2 sensor below. We also have tree plantations, and then there's a large cassava field. And as you can see, kind of from the data that we're coming off of them, each of the three different sites has quite a bit of variation, depending on if you're flying in the morning before 9 a.m., kind of in that brunch noontime window, versus after 12, where you're getting the highest amount of solar radiation there, and you have quite a lot more variation, more in that intensively managed landscape versus the rainforest. And so if you're trying to close the checkbook on all these CO2, water vapor, you're going to want to be able to access all those different levels of those hill slopes. And so we also, can, one challenge with this is really just being able to fly in some of these areas. So here's just another example of data we've been able to collect with those sensors on those drones. Where we've had to put some innovations in is sometimes it's hard to detect if we actually want to go and do sampling of those leaves that we're monitoring the CO2 and water vapor by. And that's where some of the computer vision stuff comes in. So you can see our little CO2 sensors suspended from the drone. But if we want to get closer to, let's say, a branch or a leaf, then we need a little assistance from our computer vision. And that's where I've worked a little bit more, where we identify automatically what path the robot should take to get the optimum sampling, maybe where we're going to get that CO2 water vapor based on the topography, based on what the robot's able to see. and get some assistance with that, as well as being able to more specifically identify and isolate individual trees, as you can see in this video right here, where you kind of have this big heterogeneous or homogeneous layout, but you want to isolate a specific tree with which to place your sensor by and have some better positioning. Because if you're a person piloting this, you're going to lose a little bit of spatial awareness. So having the robot help you out in a way, you can think of it as kind of like Google Maps helps you out a little bit of where you want to kind of target. That's some innovation that we've built in with computer vision to make the drones a little bit different and smarter other than just what comes off the shelf. So that's kind of our second application there. So now I want to transition us to ground robots. These are our little rovers. And this is going to look a little bit more traditional of managing landscapes here all throughout the Midwest. So I had a project that was looking at energy sorghum for its growth and transition into biofuel. So we're interested in measuring and managing large energy sorghum plots. Now, the thing that we'd actually like to do here is to be able to measure those individual plants, stalk diameter, height, and all of that. And sending people is kind of the traditional way that has always been done. And you can imagine that if you sent two, three graduate students, you're going to get two, three or different measurements, especially if the wind is blowing. But the robots never get tired, unlike the graduate students. They usually get pretty consistent measurements and they can go out there all day. And so that's one reason why you might want to deploy ground robots instead of people to do measurements on plants to be able to do things like biomass predictions. So there are lots of different types of ground robots, everything from small shoebox size robots to a little bit mid-sized person size, even up to large machinery. So you see quite a bit of variation in ground robots. The advantage that ground robots do give you is that at some point your crop canopy is going to grow over and you just will not see down below where some of the more interesting things are happening. And that's why we use ground robots as well, and maybe a little bit smaller form factor instead of the large tractors and harvesters. But I don't want anybody to think that size is a limitation here. We can do all kinds of stuff. So when I talk about little shoebox size robots, this is what I'm talking about, like what you see here, a little ground vehicle that can go between the rows of let's say a plot in either sorghum or corn and take pictures from above, measure things at the soil and all that kind of good stuff. And so we've tested this out. The name of the project was TerraMap. This is a Department of Energy, and we're doing phenotyping for sorghum. And this is our robot here. And here's a little bit of what the prototype was. In the beginning, we had to put some aggressive tracks on it so it didn't get stuck in our nice Midwest soil when it gets muddy. Very different than when you take it someplace over like, let's say, Georgia, where the soil is very sandy. So the robot's got to be able to handle a lot of different conditions. And most of this was inspired by work that I had done previously in search and rescue robots, where we'd send little shoebox size robots down into collapsed buildings where people and dogs couldn't go. So there's a lot of stuff that's been, transitioned from those more complicated domains into agricultural domains, let's say over about the last 10 years, at least in my time, most of my career. And our sensors go all up and down this mast, and we've got the different sensors that we use. Here's an actual video of a deployment. You can see when the wind starts picking up and you got 16-foot high sorghum plants, you're going to encounter all kinds of stuff. So you got to have a ground platform that's pretty robust. It's not going to fall over. So this is not looking like the little toys that people buy at the little hobby toys that people buy at the store. The weight of this particular robot, and please ignore all the wires hanging out right there, is about 200 pounds, but it could still be easily carried. Most of that weight is due to the actual batteries in there. And so it needs to be pretty stable as it goes through the field and collects all those measurements fairly consistently. So I mentioned those sensors. And so we have some standard stuff like GoPros that are getting us the light penetrating through the canopy, like getting leaf area index, and some stereo cameras that are going to get 2.5-degree measurements so we can get those things like stalk diameter, leaf angle distribution, the height of plants, and stuff like that. And so here are just some measurements and placements of those sensors of how we did it on that project. So it's about 3 sensors on a side. One thing that I will mention for all of our robot deployments is that you have to have a good cache that you take out to be able to set up your robots. So it's going to be things like a little base station that's going to be comfortable for the person that actually goes out there and deploys it. We've got some papers. I'm happy to share those with the follow-up here, where we talk about like all the things that you would want to have through all of our lessons learned in deploying these robots in the field. Visualization is a big part, being able to see what the robot sees in real time so you don't get back to the lab and realize, oops, we made a mistake. Being able to see that's important for deployment as well. And here's an example of some of the data that we've collected and the size that would come out for a particular deployment. We are very much in the terabyte scale. So that's something you want to keep in mind, and I kind of have that at the end on the recommendations. So here are some views of some images that would come off for those. And we create basically 3D point clouds and are able to take physical measurements of the plants based on what the robot sees. And so there's different filtering that we can do to ultimately get us down to the measurements that we want. Let's say in the case of what you see here are what the height of all those plants. And that gets geo-referenced back to our GIS database so that the plant scientists can understand how these seed lines are growing and figure out which ones need to come forward into future generations. So some takeaways. I think the ground robot platforms are pretty mature, but we can always use better sensors. Multi-purposing the UGVs, the ground vehicles, it's sometimes people build a robot just for a cornfield, but maybe it doesn't work so good in a sorghum field and vice versa, or in very slope, or I mentioned those sandy Georgia soils where things get a tendency to get stuck and things like that. Human robot interaction, what I work on, still tends to be pretty important. So those are some of the takeaways from us using those vehicles. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here in the last couple minutes that we have are waterways. That's a big deal in the Midwest. And so we've worked in areas like the natural riparian zones along natural. We've worked in agricultural drainage channels where you have tile drains flowing into. And then sometimes we have these natural urban tributaries, and they all kind of have their, little peculiarities. It's a lot easier to get into, let's say, riparian areas than some of the natural areas just due to accessibility of the waterway in itself. So you have to think about that when you're deploying. There's different sizes of those robot boats, from the small shoebox size that we work with all the way to more like a car size. And depending on your needs, let's say if you're going to go out to a coastal waterway, you're going to want something a little bit more robust than the shoebox size robots. What you see down there below are a little bit of the parameters for what we could do with a small robot boat. For example, we could get a payload that's up to 100 pounds. That would be pretty hard to do on the drone, but you can do it with the boat if you have the buoyancy right. Okay. So here are some of the examples of the boats that we have here at Iowa State that we've deployed. About 18 inches, 36 inches long. We can do about a mile on the distance, and we have smaller size payloads on our boats, and that works just fine for us. Endurance, 1 to 4 hours, but if you put bigger batteries on there, you can pretty much go all day. Some of the sensors that we do, we have our video, we have our water quality measurements that we're able to take. Here are some examples of low flow conditions where we've used the boats where the waterways are maybe only a couple of inches deep. This is what it might look like for a low flow condition. For the high debris conditions where the flow is not really moving, the little airboats that we have can skip over debris in the water. That's very helpful. That's what the boats let us do. We also might have the high flow conditions where we've had, let's say, a flooding event, and so the boats are going to be able to skim along there, even though there's a lot of mass of water moving through that. So that's one more example of the deployments of the boats. Now, you might say, well, why aren't you using the drones in these riparian areas? Well, the thing is that we've learned is that it's just really hard to see anything in some of those areas. You see the small robot flying there on the left, but if you're flying that thing, hard to see, and it's even harder to get the robot to see where it is because you get a lot of shadows and a lot of debris in the water. And that's why the boats are kind of better, even in those high debris situations, because you just lose the robot that's flying. And if it flies into something you didn't know that was there, you're going to lose your robot. So don't do that. The other area that I mentioned was with tile drain. So being able to deploy off of public bridges and go in and do tile drain measurement or tile drain inspection for either vegetation or maybe corrosion or something like that. That's what the small robot boats buy us. And because we use visualization on the boats, we can see when the vegetation gets really high, but even if we were flying an aerial vehicle and the vegetation covers over all of the outlets, maybe if we were just wanting to inspect that at all, sometimes we can lose it, right? And so if we have our thermal camera on there, you'll see the outlets that you didn't even see were there, and you wouldn't have seen that with the boat or the aerial vehicle. And many times this stuff isn't mapped. So it's kind of like having a bucket that you're filling with all of these hoses and not necessarily knowing there's hoses in there at all where water is coming out. Your bucket might fill faster than you think it is doing. And that's what the boat's bias is, the ability to do this mapping. And we are following WOTUS such that if we're not touching the bottom, we can deploy on those public bridges. And as long as we're on the top of the water, then we're okay. So we've done some work here also at Iowa State where we've done some mapping of Lake Laverne with our other robot boat that we've got here in the lab that we have a similar payload on, and we're able to create those maps of pH, dissolved oxygen, temperature, and we can look at that and look at the spatial distribution of all of those measurements to tell us something a little bit more about the health of the ecosystem of that lake that we just have here on campus. But we've done that in many different places. We've made maps like this in India too. I would say that a lot more of those water bodies were much more mixed, and you didn't see that much variation, which is why I wanted to show you what we see here at Lake Laverne. So a couple of takeaways on the small robot boats. I think a lot of it comes down to being able to get in and out of the waterway. That's going to matter, and that's going to inform maybe what size of the small robot boat that you're using. Durability is always a main factor in waterways. I always tell people that robots and water really do mix, but a toaster will always fail in a car wash. That's why you want to get boats that have sealed motors and things like that and sealed payloads because you think you're doing it right, and then your boat will maybe turn over. And that's not a big deal if everything's sealed up. But if you have to get it back and it's you've had an overturning event, you don't want all your stuff ruined. And so you just have to be careful that the robot that you are using would be able to handle more of those wet conditions, which you don't run into maybe with the aerial vehicles or the ground vehicles. And then the last thing that I always caution people is be careful how many sensors you put on there. You might just get what you ask for, which may be many terabytes of data that you have to then sift and filter through, because if you put it on there, it will collect it. And you may end up with a big data problem at the end of that deployment. But those robots are very much ready to go now that I showed you, and I would encourage people to consider using them in their measurement and managing of different types of ecosystems for conservation. So to kind of wrap it up here, as I'm at the 25 or 26-minute point, again, my work mostly in that HRI space. And I'm in that space because I think it's important for us to measure and manage, and robots can help us get those data points that might have been difficult in space or in time or in cost. And I think as we kind of move forward, all those payloads that I showed you, they'll only get different and better and allow us to do new things. And so that's a big part of why I'm doing this, because it can help us understand these systems better than we can now. So with that, I'll turn it back over to our host, and I think I'll just wait for some questions then.
Yes, thank you so much. If you want to go ahead and advance to the next couple slides.
Sure.
The first one will be our CEA CEU credit information. So if you would like to get a CCA CEU for attending today's webinar, please email my coworker Elena Whitaker, that's ALENAW at iastate.edu by 5 p.m. today with the name you watched the webinar with and the name that you have registered for your CCA number, along with that CCA number, and we will get that submitted on your behalf. So again, that's ALENAW at iastate.edu for that CCA credit. You want to go ahead and get to the next one for me? We have a voluntary demographic survey that we would really appreciate attendees to fill out. If you've already done so for 2025, thank you. And if you have not, you can access that like 2-minute demographic survey by scanning this QR code here or visiting the URL listed on the screen. That's iowalearningfarms.org/survey. We'd appreciate you doing so as a USDA funded program. All right, go ahead to the next one. You can join us next week with Justin Meissen. He's the research program manager at the Tallgrass Prairie Center located at the University of Northern Iowa. And he's going to be discussing expanding the value of egg conservation programs for monarch butterfly recovery right here in Iowa. So that's going to be February 5th, again at noon Central Time. And I think a couple more slides here. Yep. So we archive all of our webinars, so you can find those either on our website, iowalearningfarms.org, or you can find us on our YouTube channel, simply searching for Iowa Learning Farms webinars as you go to YouTube. There you can find them sorted by year and topics. So if there's a specific topic that interests you most, you can dive in or look at them chronologically. And I believe there's one more. Yes. So coming up, it's hard to believe that next week's already February, but we're going to be doing a partnership webinar series with the Midwest Cover Crops Council. So this will be a week-long webinar series starting February 10th. They'll all be held from 12 to 1 p.m. Central Time. So you can find more about this series on our website, but also on the Midwest Cover Crops website to find more. We'll be using the same registration link, so you don't have to worry about signing up. So feel free to join us again for that week-long series starting February 10th. I do believe that is the last one. Yes. Okay. So we do have a few questions that have come in. So this question ties back to your work, I believe, in Costa Rica. They're asking, how do you measure gases from an aerial drone given the propeller wash?
That's a great question. You get a lot of turbulence immediately underneath the drone itself. And so that's why you have to suspend the CO2 or water vapor sensor or whatever you're trying to measure at an appreciable distance away from the drone. So think about it, it's hanging, several meters below it, but we're flying maybe at 50 meters, 70 meters above the ground. So that's okay. We're not going to run into anything, but it is suspending it far enough away that you would get a dampening of that jet wash or that prop wash. And that also matters too. Let's say you're an entomologist or somebody who works with pollen and you're wanting to go out and collect pollen samples or insect samples. You do not want to blow away your samples. So usually people will extend sensors out beyond the turbulent region of where that prop wash is. So that's how we did it in Costa Rica. I don't remember exactly how long the string is, but that also caused an issue with if you're piloting that little drone and you're trying to hover that sensor that might be, we'll just make up a number. Let's say it's like 3 meters away, 4 meters away, and you're trying to kind of put it right next to that tree canopy. That is, you'll get both the swing from that CO2 sensor that's a little heavily weighted and you're trying to kind of position it correctly, and that's where that extra computer vision and maybe some distance sensing will help us out because if you're just kind of watching it, you get that two-dimensional view, and so it's hard to kind of see where you're putting the thing at. But it does. That's a good question. It has to be an appreciable distance away. Otherwise, you will get mixing and turbulence, and then your readings could be incorrect. Yeah. And there's probably a follow-up, and I know there was a paper that was written about this that I think it was Texas A&M was the lead on that, Gretchen Miller, and I'm sure that length of that distance was described in there in the methodology.
There's a couple questions here. They're similar yet a little different.
Okay.
Asking about destroying identified invasives, specifically green leafy spurge, and or robots to address weeds, either by pulling them or spot spraying them. So are there robots that can be used to identify and remove unwanted plant material?
So I guess the answer is it depends. I have to admit, I don't actually know what green leafy spurge is, but uh, if it is something that is like a vine or something like that, it would, there may be better tools suited to do something like that. If you were trying to physically manipulate, one thing that we do work on is how do you fly a drone in the middle of a tree canopy to collect samples? Maybe that involves like snipping something off. Maybe you're trying to pull the flowers off on something. That is, if the mass of what you're dealing with and its complexity can be handled by the form factor that the robot is in, then the answer is probably nothing off the shelf. If it is something that needs to be shredded or mowed, that's going to be something for a different piece of equipment. If it's something to be sampled or scooped out of the water, like duckweed, then you could probably augment a robot to do something like that. But it really just depends on the mass and the complexity of that vegetation that you're trying to deal with and what would be the appropriate robot as a tool for the job as compared to some other piece of equipment. Yeah.
So something like
There
one
was
of
this.
the ground robots that could be used to, travel through a crop system and either identify weeds by physical removal or spot spraying. Is that something that is maybe in the horizon?
Yeah, there's people who put lasers on little ground robots that go along. I think there's two parts of it. One, it's identifying the thing that you don't want there, like weed detection. For sure, people can do that kind of stuff off of drones, off of ground robots. I've seen projects where people have done lasers to try to eliminate weeds instead of using pesticides, and that is going to involve both the vision part of detecting where the plant is and then the positioning part to be able to target that and shoot it with a laser or steam jet or something like that. There's all kinds of stuff like that. I'd say it's probably in the R&D space. If it's a question related to can I go buy this somewhere? Most of this stuff is still pretty custom, but kind of the sky's the limit on doing it. It's just kind of waiting for the project to connect with. And so that was the invasive, and you mentioned there was another question.
Yeah, that was a little bit later. It was about the addressing weeds, but there's one here of could your technology be used to measure biomass, for example, in a growing cover crop? Because there's a point where the estimated uptake of excess nutrients in the field is measured by the total biomass of the cover crop itself.
Well, I think if it was something like, I guess it would depend on the crop. If it was something like um, corn or sorghum that we've worked on in the past, 100%, you could absolutely do that. Soybeans, kind of, because depending on how they're planted, certainly we could get under them. If it's like a grass or like a wheat, that's a little bit more complicated because you don't want to crush the things by rolling over them. So you have to change kind of the form factor that you have going through it. It would probably be a little drone would be better suited for getting the biomass on something like that. So if it were more of like a grassy type cover crop, then the short answer is yes. You could probably get the height of the crop and an approximation for the density of a crop if it were more of like a grassy type crop. But if you had more individualized plants like corn, sorghum, you could get it in a way that I demonstrated. With soybeans, it depends on the growth cycle of where you're talking about estimating the biomass. You would actually probably do soybeans in two different iterations. You could do early growth before they close the canopy with a drone. Probably the easiest way to do it with some type of LiDAR. After it closes, you can't see anything. I mean, you can see the height, but you can't see anything that's happening underneath as far as growth or temperature or moisture or anything like that. And then that's where the little ground robot could do. But certainly you could get the top. But it's kind of like when we're doing the water, like you can't really see below the water surface. So you kind of have to do a twofer. So it might not only be one robot, it might be actually two robots. And it might also, the decision of what to use and how you use it might also be impacted by the extent of what you want to survey. So if you had a small, more pilot area that you could then scale reasonably out to a much larger area, you could take your time a little bit more with a multi-robot approach. If you said, well, one part of this field, if we just go out there and survey that, then we could kind of extend that to the rest of our fields and then get a kind of a ballpark estimate for what might be happening from a nutrient transport perspective if we understood more of a subset of that. So that's not a great answer, but it kind of just depends.
So last couple questions here. I'll ask them separately because they are different enough, but they both deal with wildlife. So
Okay.
they're asking if there's any work been done to gather information on like a waterway pre and post the introduction of beavers. So maybe that's a collaboration effort
Yeah.
opportunity.
So I have a lot of these projects. I have a project in Alaska right now where we're looking at beaver encroachment for the in glacial ponds that are on riverways or meltways from glaciers that evolve and can get incised when glacial melt happens. The problem is the beavers have moved into these areas and they're damming up these you get these ponds which are affecting the permafrost melt and the ponds will kind of freeze over, but the beavers have things going on. So we actually have a project right now where we have an underwater uncrewed system where we're trying to observe beaver behavior like all year round, but also then get those measurements under the ice when it freezes down to get pH, turbidity, things like that. And we have to run continuously, and it's a little complicated up there because it's dark half the year. So we have a kind of a power issue. But kind of back to the beaver observations, yes, and so it kind of also depends on the waterway that you would wanting to be enter and monitor. If it was like a fast flowing waterway, then you're going to have some problems like keeping an underwater vehicle kind of. We talk about station keeping, kind of like if you locked onto a GPS point and wanted to hover above ground with a drone. If you want to do that same kind of station keeping under the water for a fast flowing like agricultural tributary or kind of rapid river, that is where maybe more of a fixed position stationary camera would be better. But if it was more of a low flow condition, like some of those I showed, like the ponds that I'm talking about, then you could have more flexibility with a tethered vehicle that could run rather continuously to do some kind of underwater mapping. But we're doing that right now in Alaska, but haven't done it really here in the Midwest. So anybody who's looking to write a proposal to do something like that, let's talk.
So, and maybe you have an anecdote or two that you'd like to share with your different type of robots. Have you had any encounters or experiences with wildlife? Maybe being a little curious with what it is that you're doing.
So, I mean, probably I've had fish like catfish go after the little small robot boats. Sometimes you can see kind of poking around. Nothing usually happens. I've had birds kind of go and poke around the drones. I can't say I've really had any anything happen too much with the ground robots. They're not that interesting. We have had some unintended consequences happen with the ground robots that might be worth mentioning. Um, those sorghum plants and corn plants have brace roots that allow for stability of the plants, and lodging when those roots give way and the plants fall over is kind of a problem that the plant science people are trying to figure out. It turns out that people have long hypothesized that those plants that grow on edge rows have more hardy brace roots because the wind and animals bump up against them and things like that. We ran a little experiment where we had the robot when it was going through the cornfields and the sorghum fields. We put these little paddles on the sides, so we call it the slapper. And it would slap the plants. And we did this little study where we were able to measure with a little tool the structural stiffness and flexure of the stalk and the brace roots after we conducted these trials. And what we found was is the robot going through and disturbing the plants were causing there to be more rigidity in a good way with the actual plants themselves. So the plants were more hardy versus the plots. It was a big whole controlled experiment that did not have a robot applied as one of the conditions. And so that was kind of an unintended consequence of using the robots in kind of a managed ecosystem that you kind of get a little bit of a twofer, but never had. I've had like a moose go after a weather station up in northern Alaska, but nothing out of the ground vehicle and nothing outside of just a friendly bird or a curious catfish.
Oh, great. Well, on that note, that is a great way to wrap up this interaction with robots, technology, humans, and nature. So again, thank you everyone for tuning in today, and thank you, Dr. Peschel, for sharing the work that you're doing. in this series. And with that, I will give the final word to you as we wrap things up today.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you all. If anybody is interested in contacting me about maybe doing some new research project or proposal, I'm always interested in doing that kind of stuff. You can just contact me. I think my email address will probably be as part of the information with this, but it's just my last name, Peschel at iastate.edu. Would love to hear from you. And my take home on these robots are, if you think it's ridiculous, we can probably make it happen because one th things that used to sound really ridiculous, we're actually doing now. So dream a little bit and the sky's the limit, and let me know if you're interested in talking more.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Good to be with you.